Hello everybody and welcome to another amazing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by support on Patreon. If you would like to contribute, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. Currently, I'm running monthly polls on Patreon allowing supporters to decide on a topic, but if we hit our goal of $500 per month, the number of polls will double. But on with the episode. With the popularity of the animated film Into the Spider-Verse, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a version of the Prowler from Earth 1610, the Ultimate Universe. While he now resides on Earth 616, the mainstream Marvel Universe, he is not the first person to have used that identity there. In fact, the original Prowler long predates him, first appearing in a story originally published in 1969. And so today we're talking about the first man to use the identity, Hobie Brown. Hobie came from a large African-American family who previously lived in a poor neighborhood in San Francisco. At some point, the Browns moved to the Bronx in New York, where Hobie was born and raised. His parents' real names, as well as those of most of his siblings, are undocumented, but his father was a soldier known by the nickname Tiger. When Hobie was only a baby, Tiger Brown abandoned his family, leaving his wife to raise their 9 children alone, and she consequently grew dependent on alcohol to cope. Tiger, meanwhile, was killed in action during a military operation in Cambodia. Following that, the oldest sibling, Abraham, returned to San Francisco, leaving Hobie unprotected against bullies. Abe Brown did eventually move back to New York and became an accomplished martial artist, fittingly as part of a group called the Sons of the Tiger, who we talked about on the channel years ago. Hobie, meanwhile, grew up in New York and, after graduating from high school, found employment as a window washer. By then, the city had become a hotbed of superhero activity, and at one point Hobie was nearly collateral damage during a conflict between Daredevil and Stilt-Man. A talented inventor himself, Hobie began designing new harnesses and safety equipment. Meanwhile, he was dating a woman named Mindy McPherson, who convinced him to show his ideas to his employer. But his racist boss, a man named Clark, had no interest in even listening to what a young black man had to say. Shortly after that, while washing windows at the offices of the Daily Bugle newspaper, an already distraught Hobie was warned that Clark had arrived to berate him for working too slowly. The publisher, J. Jonah Jameson, tried to defend him, but Hobie had finally had enough and quit. Low on funds, Hobie knew that if he were to sell his inventions, he would first need recognition. He worked on his ideas to create a costume which could simulate superpowers. He initially planned on gaining notoriety by becoming a superhero, but quickly realized that that would be unreliable. Since it could potentially take too long for him to accomplish anything of note or even find a villain to defeat, he decided to create one himself. And so, using specially designed climbing equipment and gas pellets, Hobie Brown donned the masked identity of the Prowler. His plan was never to score big as the Prowler, but rather to have the Prowler be seen committing a crime, only for Hobie Brown to be the one to recover the stolen property and return it. Wanting press attention as quickly as possible, he decided to rob the Daily Bugle's payroll. Everything was going according to plan as the theft was witnessed by a photographer named Peter Parker. But things quickly went wrong when Parker stumbled backwards and seemed to throw himself out of a window. Hobie was shocked and horrified since he hadn't laid a hand on the guy and never intended to actually hurt anyone. Leaving the money behind, the Prowler quickly fled when Jameson and his city editor Joe Robertson arrived. Hobie headed up to the roof, but was intercepted by a masked vigilante with real superpowers, the amazing Spider-Man. Hobie initially tried to fight, but it soon became clear that the colorful hero was way stronger than he looked. The Prowler ultimately escaped by using a knockout gas to weaken Spider-Man. Heading back to his apartment, Hobie was overcome with guilt over Parker's supposed death and tried to plan his next move. He realized that Spider-Man was also wanted by the police and decided that he could be the one to turn him in. Staging another robbery, the Prowler lured Spider-Man in, attempting to weaken him with gas once again. But this time the wall crawler had come prepared with a filter in his mask and quickly defeated the Prowler. But after hearing Hobie's story, Spidey revealed that Parker was fine and he hadn't actually hurt anyone. He decided to let him go and encouraged him to go back to Mindy and give up on the Prowler. And so Hobie did, even getting a job with a different window washing company. One day while he was working, he was approached by Spider-Man, out of costume but still masked. He asked Hobie a peculiar favor, but of course he owed the hero one and so he agreed. Later that night, Hobie donned Spider-Man's costume and visited the home of Police Captain George Stacy. Also there was Stacy's daughter Gwen, as well as her college classmates Harry Osborn, Mary Jane Watson, and, oddly enough, Peter Parker. Impersonating Spider-Man, Hobie thanked Peter for returning his costume, making the claim that the two had a working relationship. He then slipped away using his Prowler gear beneath the Spider-Man suit to scale the wall and reach the roof. He wasn't sure why the real Spidey had asked him to do this, but trusted him enough not to question it. But then Spider-Man was later wanted in connection with Captain Stacy's death. Not knowing Spidey's true identity, Hobie began to wonder if he was being used as a patsy. Older and stronger than he was before, Hobie decided to again adopt the identity of the Prowler to confront Spider-Man. And sure enough, he found the wall crawler outside the home of Stacy's daughter, Gwen. The two battled across the rooftop, the fight taking them through a skylight and into an elevator shaft. In his eagerness to defeat the wall crawler, the Prowler lost his grip and took a nasty fall. He slowed his descent with his claws, lessening the impact, but was injured nonetheless. Spider-Man recovered Hobie and brought him to a hospital, but not before burning his costume to protect the Prowler's secret identity. As for what really happened with Spider-Man, well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you all this, but the Prowler had no idea that Spider-Man and Peter Parker were one and the same man. I'm sure you've already figured out that his little tumble through the window when he first saw the Prowler was just an excuse to get away and change into costume. As for that odd favor that he asked of Hobie, that was shortly after Peter was delirious and thought that he was losing his powers. In this state, he confessed to his closest friends that he was actually Spider-Man. They were reluctant to believe him, and Peter soon discovered that he was simply sick with a bad case of influenza. And so he told the others that he was sick and delirious when he claimed that he was Spider-Man, which was not technically a lie. And of course, the stunt with Hobie was done so that Peter and Spider-Man would be in the same place at the same time, removing any doubt. As for the death of Captain Stacy, that happened during a rooftop battle between Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus. When Spidey caused Ock to lose control of his mechanical tentacles, a stone chimney was broken and sent falling towards an innocent child. Captain George Stacy pushed the boy out of the way, but was crushed by the debris as a result. Now that we've cleared all that up, let's get back to Hobie's story and his relationship with Mindy McPherson. Those two soon married, although Mindy decided to keep her maiden name. Hobie subsequently found employment as a construction worker and was treated with more respect than he had been at previous jobs. As a little side note, he worked under a man named Sapristi, who I would presume to be the same one who worked with architect Eric Masterson. He also volunteered for the Big Brother program and mentored a boy named Manny Lopez for about a year. But then Hobie received the news that Manny had been killed in an incident at the train yard involving a vigilante called the White Tiger. And so Hobie donned a new Prowler costume and went out in search of the tiger. The two clashed, but during the fight Hobie became convinced that the other man was innocent. What really happened is that Manny had been recruited into a street gang called the Nomads. While tagging train cars, the older gang members assaulted the night watchman on duty. They gave the child a gun and ordered him to kill the watchman. But before he could pull the trigger, the White Tiger arrived and subdued the other gang members. A frightened Manny pointed the gun at this new threat, claiming that if he didn't shoot, the Nomads would hurt him and his mother. The boy fired, hitting the White Tiger in the arm, but then the night watchman fatally struck Manny in the back of the head. The truth of what happened was soon uncovered, but the White Tiger was confronted by the police during his fight with the Prowler. Although the Tiger had been cleared of Manny's death, both men were still masked vigilantes and made their separate escapes. Before I move on, I'd like to point out that there is another loose connection between the Prowler and the White Tiger. As I mentioned earlier, when Hobie was young, his older brother Abe left home and eventually became a martial artist. He and the other two students of the Tiger Dojo, Lin Sun and Bob Diamond, were collectively known as the Sons of the Tiger. Each of them wore a piece of a jade tiger amulet which endowed them with enhanced abilities while fighting together. However, Abe walked out and the amulets were abandoned after a disagreement between Bob and Lin broke out into a bloody fight. The discarded pieces were found by a young Puerto Rican man named Hector Ayala, and by putting on the completed jade tiger amulet, Hector was transformed into the White Tiger. Sometime after their initial conflict, the Prowler and the White Tiger were both among a large gathering of heroes who temporarily joined the loose-knit group known as the Defenders. This was largely due to an unauthorized documentary about the team claiming that they were accepting any who wished to join. Hobie hoped that being part of an established group would help with his own reputation, but hadn't expected so many others to show up with him. He went on a single mission alongside several other new recruits, as well as the veteran Defender Valkyrie. While battling both supervillains and trolls on board a Staten Island ferry, Valkyrie flew into a battle-maddened rage and defeated everyone around her. This included the Prowler, who promptly quit the team after being thrown from the boat. Once he pulled himself out of the water, he wrapped up his Prowler gear and put it to rest in a storage locker. But several months later, he was awakened in the middle of the night by a red light in the window. It was Spider-Man, who pulled Hobie out of bed and told him that he'd found evidence of the Prowler being involved in a recent murder. Hobie explained that he'd given up on the identity, but when he tried to show the hero where he'd locked up his equipment, they found that the storage locker had been broken into. The culprit was actually a cat burglar, sometimes called Red, whose real name is unknown, but has gone by the Cat in the past. It should be noted that this cat has no known connection to Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, the martial artist Shen Kuei, a freelance espionage who is also called the Cat, or Greer Grant Nelson, who was known as the Cat before she was Tigra. The cat in question did encounter Spider-Man once before after robbing the apartment of J. Jonah Jameson. Years after that, he started working with a villainess known as Belladonna. It was during this time that the cat stole and started using Hobie's Prowler equipment. Under orders from Belladonna, he successfully led Spider-Man into a trap. However, his employer fully intended on sacrificing him to kill Spider-Man. Spidey was able to free them both, but the cat's face was burned in an explosion. He subsequently escaped from police custody and tracked down Belladonna to take his revenge, but was intercepted by Spider-Man, who captured them both and turned them over to the authorities. Back to Hobie Brown, his wife Mindy began working as a bookkeeper for a company called Transcorp. What she didn't know was that the company was owned by the criminal industrialist Justin Hammer. When Transcorp was caught in illegal stock trading, they falsely implicated Mindy. Wanting to prove his wife's innocence, Hobie again adopted the identity of the Prowler to investigate. He learned that evidence he needed was on a microchip hidden on a valuable chalice. His attempts to claim it led to a misunderstanding with Spider-Man and a confrontation with a thief known as the Black Fox. Of course, after explaining the situation to Spider-Man, the wall crawler helped him get the proof he needed to free Mindy. When Spider-Man was later accused of stealing from millionaire Winston Walker, the Prowler decided to repay the favor by proving his innocence. During his investigation, he got into a scrap with a young man on a rocket-powered skateboard. It turned out that this rocket racer was also trying to help Spider-Man, and the two joined forces. They ultimately discovered that the hero was working with a mercenary named Silver Sable. While Spider-Man did indeed stage a robbery of Winston Walker's townhouse, it was part of a plan to expose his ties to the international crime cartel known as the Magia. Impressed by his resourcefulness, Silver Sable offered the Prowler a job. For the time being, Hobie continued working at the construction site, but one day one of his co-workers fell from the high irons. Hobie tried to save him in a daring maneuver, but unfortunately he wasn't able to grab him in time. Wanting to prevent similar accidents in the future, he spent most of the night designing a compact safety glider. And when Mindy got home late after her night classes, Hobie had fallen asleep at his desk. She woke him up and he told her what happened, and she did her best to comfort him. She also encouraged him to sell the design, but Hobie insisted it wasn't ready. However, Mindy went behind his back and showed the unfinished plans to Hammer Industries, not knowing that Justin Hammer was the man behind the Transcorp scandal. Hobie was of course dismayed, especially since he hadn't patented the design, making it easy for Hammer to steal it. Sure enough, when he investigated as the Prowler, a Hammer employee named Chris Weiser had incorporated Hobie's glider into a suit of his own. But Prowler easily defeated Weiser and destroyed the prototype wings. Following that, Hobie began learning martial arts from his brother, but wasn't terribly respectful towards him. Meanwhile, with the construction site he was working at closed, he decided to follow up on Silver Sable's offer. After proving himself in a training exercise against her mercenaries, the Wild Pack, the Prowler was sent to confront a mysterious ninja in white. This, it turns out, was actually Hobie's brother Abe, who worked with Silver Sable to help teach Hobie a lesson in humility. The Prowler was subsequently one of several outlaws recruited by Spider-Man to help him confront the Avengers. Spidey only did this because he was tricked by a young god named Calculus. Ultimately, this was all part of a complicated plan to bring the Avengers and the Outlaws together so they could defeat a humanoid swarm of carnivorous insects. The Outlaws was subsequently the name applied to the Prowler's squad while working for Silver Sable, and they did several missions for her. When the construction site opened once again, Hobie resumed working there. As the Prowler, he prevented an attempted sabotage and saved a depressed co-worker who attempted to take his own life after his wife passed away. Hobie also joined forces with his brother to defend a group of homeless people from the Flying Dragon Gang. And after that, he defended his brother's dojo against the villainous killer Shrike. During that fight, Hobie's wrist was broken, but Abe and Lin soon gave the Prowler their tiger amulets, allowing him to win. Of course, those amulets were actually just powerless replicas, since the real ones had been returned to Kunlun. In another incident, he defeated the Broken Skulls gang and convinced a boy they'd recruited to return to the Tiger Dojo. He later helped the new warrior Night Thrasher stop a gun-running ring, but disapproved of how the wealthy hero would use his fortune to buy out shady companies, but not to help fund other heroes. Fortunately, Hobie's own financial situation improved after Silver Sable helped him get hired by a company called Bestman Laboratories, who funded his night classes. He continued training with his brother and used his Prowler identity as an occasional vigilante. But his busy schedule put a strain on his relationship with Mindy, who also worked long hours. Things were made even worse when she discovered that he was really the Prowler. Meanwhile, Hobie's co-worker Eric Cross stole his inventions and used them to become the deadly Night Creeper. Using this identity, Eric also pursued vigilante justice, but was far more brutal than the Prowler since his daughter had lost the use of her legs after being caught in a gang shooting. And while that was happening, Bestman's company was taken over by a man calling himself Holden Tukes. However, Holden Tukes was actually Adrian Toombs, better known as the Vulture, who'd used experimental technology to restore his youth. Regular viewers of the channel may recall that Toombs had a long-standing enmity with John Bestman's father, Gregory. The Prowler was able to uncover the truth and ousted Toombs from the company, but not before the Night Creeper was hospitalized in a battle with the Vulture. Following this, Mindy had opportunities to grow her accounting career in California, but Hobie couldn't leave New York and the couple separated for a time. The Prowler was later convinced by Robbie Farrell, the rocket racer, to participate in a superhuman tournament called the Great Game. But because they tried to fake their match with one another, they were both attacked by the bazooka-wielding Black Bull. The two men fell from the roof, but Hobie used his own body to protect the rocket racer from the impact. Hobie was badly hurt with many broken bones, and so Robbie brought him to the hospital, doing his best to cut away most of the Prowler costume. Unfortunately, there was enough left for an orderly named Rick Lawson to piece together the truth. Hobie was bedridden for some time, during which Mindy returned to be by his side. Meanwhile, Lawson went to their home and stole one of Hobie's spare Prowler costumes. He simply planned on using it to steal enough money to be set for life, but he caught the attention of a vengeful Vulture who mistook him for the real Prowler. Lawson had to be rescued by Spider-Man and subsequently abandoned the identity. Hobie Brown later made a full recovery from his spinal injury and remained friends and allies with Spider-Man. He started working on a flying harness, but the initial designs were too heavy for a normal human to wear. Meanwhile, Spidey's life became even more difficult when a $5 million bounty was placed on his head by his old nemesis Norman Osborn. In order to keep doing good without innocent people caught in the crossfire from bounty hunters going after him, Spider-Man decided to use several alternate identities and went to Hobie for help. With his super strength, Spidey was able to wear the jetpack Hobie had created and used it to become the high-flying Hornet. After Spider-Man no longer needed that identity, it was taken up by a man named Eddie McDonough. With a reinforced version of the costume that increased his strength enough to wear it, McDonough joined up with 3 people who adopted the other discarded Spider-Man identities from that time: Dusk, Prodigy, and Ricochet, and the group was collectively known as the Slingers. However, Eddie was later killed by Wolverine after the mutant hero was brainwashed by the ninja death cult known as the Hand. Eddie's niece, Melinda, subsequently created a similar flying suit and plotted revenge as the Red Hornet. The Hornet identity was also briefly adopted by Wolverine's old foe, Silas Burr, better known as Cyber, who used it to battle Spider-Man's clone, Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider, but that's another story entirely. During all of this, Hobie continued to operate as the Prowler and aided Spider-Man on occasion. When Peter Parker owned his own company, he hired Hobie to sometimes pose as Spider-Man. Much like before, this was often a trick to show Peter and Spider-Man being around at the same time. Hobie also did work for Peter as the Prowler, but during a mission to spy on the enigmatic and suspicious company, New You, he was nearly killed by the female Electro, Francine Fry. Hobie was placed in a hidden healing chamber by New You's CEO, the previously mentioned Spider clone Ben Reilly. This was during a time in which Ben had been driven mad by repeated deaths and resurrections and had taken up the masked identity of his creator, the Jackal. A clone of the Prowler was then created by Reilly and was involved in the events of the Clone Conspiracy. That's another story we don't have time to cover here, but by the end of it, the Prowler clone was destroyed and the real Hobie returned. Suffice it to say, nearly dying caused Hobie to begin rethinking his priorities. After leaving Parker Industries, he began focusing more on his relationship with Mindy and their life together. He promised he would give up on the Prowler identity, but of course when necessary he would still answer the call to action. More recently, during the symbiote invasion of Earth instigated by the Dark God Null, Hobie debuted a perfected version of his flying harness and took on the Hornet identity himself. And so, while the name Prowler might be associated with someone else these days, Hobie Brown has continued to prove himself a smart and capable hero as the newest Hornet. And that's the story of the original Prowler, but before we end off for today, let me give one more tidbit. In the multiverse, there are many different variants of Spider-Man, many of which are alternate versions of Peter Parker. But in one universe, there is a punk rock version of Spider-Man who fights for freedom in a dystopian America. This particular Spider-Man is not a Peter Parker, a Ben Reilly, or a Miles Morales, but rather his reality's version of Hobie Brown, who was bitten by a radioactive spider. Okay, now that's all I've got for you today, but if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!